On this exciting episode, Perry's old army buddy does two things: hang around the wife of his employer Scott Shelby without a shirt on, and write down his innermost thoughts in a journal. By the time this case is over, he's gonna wish he'd kept his shirt on and that, like Prospero, he drowned his books. It's Season 1, Episode 26 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Half Wakened Wife. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each week in the Law Library, we return to prior episodes to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. This episode in the Law Library, we consider the unsure fates of some of our favorite defendants. In the case of the empty tin, Doris Hoxley really needed the cash that Elston Carr was going to give her. She's a widow living paycheck to paycheck, trying to care for a daughter afflicted with a literally crippling disease. One question the episode leaves open is what exactly happens to Doris and the $2 million when the case goes away. Perry has proven that Doris really was Adam Hoxley's daughter, thanks to the empty tin.
I submit that the pieces of evidence in Elston Carr's safe were just this empty tin box in which the rightful heir's Bible would fit, and a photograph found in the false bottom of the box which could be compared with this one. Both that Bible and that photograph were in the possession of the defendant.
But in the water cooler scene at the end of the episode, we get nothing about Doris's next move. Some other defendants I'm thinking of. What happens to the Kimber marriage at the end of the case of the silent partner? Does Mildred finally ditch Bob after Bob nearly gave away the florist shop? How about Elaine Barton, the defendant in the case of the cautious coquette, who loses her fiancé, Ross Hollister? What's she going to do? And then there's Marilyn Clark and Mrs. Morris, two more defendants from the case of the lonely heiress and the case of the fugitive nurse, respectively, who get lost in the shuffle as Perry recounts what led him to the real murderer at the end of their respective episodes. Here's my speculation about each of them. 1. Doris, from the case of the empty tin, does get the cash with Perry's help and is able to move her daughter back home. And then with the help of Gao Lung, she establishes a charity for the invalid children of Chinese immigrants. Number 2, Bob and Mildred. Well, I think they stick together, but Mildred deprives Bob of his stock options, and without Sam Link to help him with his gambling, Bob begins playing dominoes for petty cash with the florist manager Tulloch. And with the added stress of having Bob always around the shop, Mildred never fully recovers. Number 3, Elaine Barton. She gets enough from Ross Hollister's estate and a magnanimous Sheila Cromwell to help sustain her until she's done grieving over Ross, a process I think will take 2 years, and then finds another rich bachelor whose pool she can dive into and spend 30 seconds in before she starts sunning herself. Number 4, Marilyn Clark. I think she stays in Los Angeles, marries a big Hollywood exec, and gets her stepbrother George a cushy producing job. What do you think? And then number 5, Mrs. Morris, the wife of the doctor who's flown the coop with his nurse, I think she does some real soul searching and uses her part of Dr. Morris's estate to swoop in and pick up the Kirby Drive-In for a song now that it no longer has its main proprietor. And she dedicates her life to customer service, giving a whole pickle to her customers to garnish that coleslaw. Let me know what you think happened to each of these defendants. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The case of the half-wakened wife. Perry's buddy, Frank Lawton, wants to write, and boy does he have a tale to tell. He has enough life experience to write a novel, if not a memoir, if Perry is to be believed about his old war buddy.
Remember I told you what happened to him on D-Day?
Sounds like he's still in trouble.
Dilla, Trouble is Frank Lawton's middle name. He was shot twice during the service. The week he came home, his wife was killed in an accident. Looks like the jinx is still operating.
But instead of working through his PTSD and grief through his writing, Lawton mostly just pines away for the wife of his employer, the useless Scott Shelby. Now Lawton gallivants shirtless about the Shelby estate, pruning plants, attending to household chores, and when he can, talking with the sympathetic Mrs. Shelby.
Pretty well done on that side, Mrs. Shelby. How about a drink of water?
Oh, I'd love it.
One water coming up.
You know, you're the handiest handyman I ever knew.
Now, Mrs. Shelby affects an ease around Frank, but there's no actual hanky-panky.
Did the defendant, Frank Lawton, ever make improper advances toward you?
Never.
They're more drawn together on account of their mutual hatred of Scott.
Friend here is quite a writer. I'd like to read you some of his stuff. August 10th. That was just 2 days ago. Sometimes I think I'll never understand women. There's no logical reason for Marion to put up with them. She's lovely and generous, qualities that to him are laughable. When I realize how many decent men are killed, I wonder why a man like Shelby should be permitted to live.
Scott doesn't just make the life of his wife miserable, he bilks his customers too, using his triple mortgaged estate as a way to quickly raise capital, and then leaving people like his accountant or some other lackey to clean up his messes.
Well, Shelby promised to send me a check for $8,500 by 11 o'clock this morning.
It isn't Mr. Shelby's fault, Mr. Parker. I didn't finish the job yet. I'm supposed to make out the checks and take them out for signature this afternoon.
All right, Williams. But you tell Shelby that if he doesn't have a check in my hands by 6 o'clock tonight, I'm going to see him in person. And I won't be interested in just the money anymore.
Even worse, he's an adulterer who plans to run away with over $100,000 and his current paramour, Ellen Waring, and leave Frank Lawton holding the bag. At first, Mason thinks that Shelby fakes his own death when he turns up missing. But when Scott really does end up dead, hoisted by his own petard to use the show's repeated phrase, Lawton gets the blame and Perry has to save his old army buddy from the prosecutorial firing squad. The case takes place in Pinewood, a small town with a very young district attorney. Neither Tragg nor Berger appear in the case, but it feels like Pinewood's prosecutor is taking notes from his bumbling LA colleagues. And once again, Perry does the detective legwork that the DA just won't do. Perry focuses on Ellen Waring, Shelby's lover, who has quickly married Shelby's accountant in the wake of Shelby's death and claims she couldn't know anything about Shelby's disappearance because she was too busy getting proposed to by that accountant, Art Williams. Williams even has the photographs to prove it.
Can you establish the fact that you were at the Kleiner estate between 2 o'clock and 5:30 on the afternoon of August 12th?
I most certainly can. My husband is an amateur photographer, and he has some photographs that were taken there that same day. Arthur, will you show Mr. Mason the pictures you took?
But Perry wisely interrogates Art about the alleged time he took the photographs by going out to the scene with Paul and Della, taking pictures of his own and then demonstrating that the shadows in Art's pictures reveal he couldn't have taken them in the afternoon.
Your Honor, I should like to introduce into evidence this photograph taken at the lake on the Kleiner estate at exactly 1:55. I should further like to direct the attention of the court to the fact that the afternoon shadow cast by the barbecue is pointing directly east, while the shadow in the photograph taken by Mr. Williams is pointing west.
But it's not Art who committed the crime, and it certainly wasn't Ellen Waring. It was Mrs. Shelby, Frank's muse, and for once, we have something like a smoking gun.
She did it. I saw her.
Whom did you see? Mrs. Shelby?
Yes, it was her.
He's a liar. How can you believe a man like that?
She gave me $10,000. She was supposed to pay me more later. I got the money home. I never even touched it.
Can you prove that Mrs. Shelby gave you the money?
Yes, and I can prove why she paid me. I never go anywhere without my camera. And on that night in the boat, I had it with me. It was loaded with infrared film, with an infrared flashbulb attachment. I didn't trust Shelby, and I wanted to protect myself. When I heard the gunshot, I took the picture. My wife has it now.
Frank ends the episode by painting my writing teacher's soul and throwing away his notebooks. No, Frank, don't do it. Now let's compare the episode with the 1945 novel it was adapted from. Now this one takes the cake. Guess who the defendant in the novel is? Mrs. Shelby. That's right. The very woman who becomes the murderer in the episode is the defendant in the novel. She's still a half-wakened wife, and it's still her husband, Scott, who gets got, only this time it's on a yacht. There's still an Ellen Waring character, but she's not having an affair with Shelby. In fact, she's kind of creeped out by the lecherous Shelby. It's her boyfriend, Art, who's secretly in cahoots with Shelby, and who Ellen forces to marry her when it becomes clear that, yep, he was the one who murdered Shelby. The kicker, Perry brings all of this out in a private deposition because he's being sued by Ellen Waring for initially suspecting her of hiding Shelby, just like in the show. Both Mason and Drake stand to pay $250,000 if they lose the suit. That's over $3.5 million in today's cash and damages. Ouch. But of course, Perry uses the opportunity to grill her in the deposition, and the truth comes out. I really enjoyed this novel, though I can still see the skill that teleplay writer Stanley Niss brought to bear on the episode by creating a brand new defendant who actually gives us some background info on Perry. Now, where did the idea of the TV episode's Frank Lawton come from? Well, the novel features a know-it-all character named Lawton Keller, a would-be ladies' man who provides a red herring for the real murderer. And then there's a character barely mentioned named Frank, who we never really see, and who is a crippled war veteran. If you combine their backgrounds, you get an old war buddy of Perry's who has woman troubles. Now, you may also notice that the novel's murderer is Arthur Lacey, not Arthur Williams. Why the switch? At least in the name? Well, the showrunners had already used the name Arthur Lacey for the made-for-TV character Edmund Arthur Lacey in the case of The Lonely Heiress. Gardner apparently dug the results of the episode too, so everybody turned out happy. Now let's get trivial, shall we?
This is for a roll of film taken to their store by my secretary a little more than an hour ago. Do you see any notation of time on that receipt?
Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul this week concerns photography development. Perry sure gets those photos he turns in quickly from his local developer. Now, I tend to associate the hour-long photo development with the huts that went boom and bust in the time preceding and immediately following the advent of digital photography. So this week's research prompt, it's 1958. You've got a roll of film you want a professional to develop, and you want those photos post-haste. Where would you take them? How quickly could you get the photos back? And what would the entire process cost you? Our Della this week concerns Jonathan Hole, the actor who portrays the nebbishy Arthur Williams, the new Mr. Ellen Waring.
You must be Mr. Parker.
Who are you?
Art Williams. I'm Mr. Shelby's accountant.
One reason I was intrigued by Jonathan Hole was that he was born in Hardin County, Iowa, went to school in Des Moines, and graduated from Drake University, the Des Moines college that my Uncle David taught at for many years. Mr. Hole cut his teeth in stock theater companies in the late 1920s and worked as a radio announcer throughout the 1930s, including time at WBBM in Chicago. If he seems like a that guy kind of actor, it's because he was. He appeared 7 times each in Dragnet, Burke's Law, and Green Acres. He was in 5 different Maverick episodes, 5 different Perry Mason episodes, and he was also Orville Monroe, the Undertaker on the Andy Griffith Show. He was married to the actress Betty Hanna, who he met while he was doing summer stock in Dayton, Ohio in the 1920s. He died at the age of 93, and he and his wife Betty are buried side by side in L.A. A small-town Iowa boy made good. Our Perry this episode could go several ways. Sure, there's Perry's World War II backstory. Gardner's character was not a war veteran, but the TV Perry was. Now, fans of the show will know that in later seasons, it appears that Perry was in the Pacific during World War II, not in Europe with Lawton's company. We hear that Lawton was injured during the D-Day invasion. It's not until the case of the misguided missile in episode 120 where we get more details about Perry's service career. But I'm more intrigued by 2 other factoids. 1, we get a hint about Perry's out-and-out celebrity status in this throwaway comedic scene with the telegraph delivery man.
You Perry Mason?
Yes?
Well, what do you know?
Well, I know you have a telegram for me.
Huh?
I say I know you have a telegram for me.
Oh, yes, of course. You'll have to sign for it.
I'll sign.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Mason. What'll I tell the fellows about this?
2, we discovered that Perry uses an electric razor. You can hear its buzz in this scene with Paul.
Well, I simply don't believe Frank Lawton murdered Scott Shelby.
You say that because Frank Lawton's your friend.
Yes? I also say it because I don't think Shelby is dead.
I think that freshly shaved, handsome mug of Perry's is one reason he gets so much attention. Our theme for this episode is art. This episode ridicules the closet rioter, warning your sensitive scribbles will only land you in jail. In fact, Perry Mason suspects art in general. Frank, the wannabe novelist, gets accused of murder. Art Williams uses his art form, photography, to manufacture a fake alibi. Looking at past episodes, we find that the movies are no better. They breed blackmail and homicide. In the case of the sulky girl, would-be painter Rod Gleason is charged with murder, and faux aesthete Addison Doyle commits the crime in the case of the green-eyed sister. It's bad news when someone in the show says they traffic in fiction or artificially represented reality. Here's my guess as to this show's dismissal of writing. First, keeping a diary is a far cry from, quote, working on your writing, end quote. What is Lawton reading? I guess he knows Hemingway?
No, don't get me wrong. I'm no Ernest Hemingway. I'll probably never write the great American novel or much of anything else.
But does he ever plan to publish anything? Second, I think his occupation with writing indicates a dangerous preoccupation with himself. He was once a soldier and husband. These 2 vocations required a basic selflessness. He's relaxed, grown accustomed to a simpler life that isn't as demanding. If anything, a diary should give him space to work through his war experiences and then the loss of his wife. His fascination with Mrs. Shelby and anger against Mr. Shelby, however, feel like displaced emotions. On the one hand, his decision to throw away his notebooks at the end of the episode could signal a new, art-free, no deception approach to life. If he has something to say, he'll say it. To me, though, it feels like another way of hiding. I wonder if Frank got the message of the episode. Writing doesn't have to mean exchanging real life for dreams. If Frank sat down and told his actual life story, including the experience of being framed for murder, he might just get somewhere. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. Money is no laughing matter, but sometimes it's best to make a joke out of someone who is trying to downplay how much money a certain swindling murder victim has stolen. Arthur Williams gives a sheepish answer about the discrepancy in the Shelby books, and Perry promptly calls him on it.
Was Mr. Shelby's personal account exactly as it should be?
No, there was a slight discrepancy.
Oh? How much?
$120,000.
Well, I'm glad you're so affluent, Mr. Williams, that you can dismiss $120,000 as a slight discrepancy.
Perry probably isn't going to get a whole lot of payment from Frank Lawton for his work on this case. Of course, friendship trumps cash, but Perry doesn't want people to forget how important money is, and Arthur Williams should know that. He's an accountant, for crying out loud. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
There is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Thanks to everyone who gave me feedback on the last episode. Our poll last week concerned gun runners in China and the surrounding countries. My Aunt Myra came up with some interesting facts about U.S. involvement in China. She discovered that the CIA invested $100 million in buying weapons that could be used by third force guerrillas in China, but could find few anti-Mao soldiers to give those guns to, except for some refugees in Okinawa who were more interested in achieving their own goals than they were in helping the United States. Also, this according to Wikipedia, there was a group called China Hands who thought the communists could further U.S. interests more than Chiang Kai-shek. And she also brought up the novel The Ugly American, a 1958 political novel by Eugene Burdick and William Lederer that depicts the failures of the U.S. diplomatic corps in Southeast Asia. My own research led me to two things. First, the U.S. had an arms embargo against China between 1912, when the Republic of China was first formed, and 1928, when the U.S. finally recognized the ruling government as legitimate. And a lot of gun runners apparently made cash getting weapons illegally to China during that period. Second, look up the guy Samuel Cummings if you're looking for a guy, a private individual who made cash getting arms to various people. This guy's International Armament Corporation came to dominate the free world market in private arms sales. He was born in America, and he capitalized on the post-war excess of arms and ammunition and provided not only the U.S. market with military firearms, but ended up supplying revolutionaries in places like Cuba and the Dominican Republic weapons as well. No, there's not a direct Elston Carr analog, but there's certainly enough there to show that Gardner knew men like Carr must have existed, and that the plot angle was worth focusing on for at least one novel and one television episode. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this week's pod that you'd like to comment on or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All Perry Pod episodes are now available via Spotify and YouTube as well as iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Next time, we get Werner Klemperer, aka Colonel Klink, as a, wait for it, German operative. I know, it's a stretch. It's the case of the desperate daughter. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!